We continue now at the top of Daf Memheyam and Beis and Meseches Avodah Zara. This is Avodah Zarah Daf 45b. On the previous Amud, there was a machlokas Tanoim in the Mishnah, but both Tanoim seem to be saying the same thing. Both the Tanakama and Rav Yossi Aglili were saying that the mountains and the hills themselves, they do not have the status of Avodah Zara, and they are permitted. And so the question is, what exactly were the Tanakama and Rav Yossi Aglili arguing about in the Mishnah? And the Gemara is now in the middle of presenting Rav Shesh's understanding of the machlokas between the Tanakama and Rav Yossi Aglili in the Mishnah. And the Gemara continues and explains, V'hacha over here, Be'ilon shenato ulevasof avodo kamiflagi. Here they're arguing, let's say you had a tree that was planted and then it was only worshipped later on. That's the question. Again, in the Mishnah it said that there is such a thing as an Asherah tree. Asherah tree is forbidden, and the Rabbi Yossi Aglili said in the Mishnah the reason is because it's planted by people. There's human involvement, and of course the Tanakama also has to agree that there's a concept of an Asherah tree. But the machlokas is, what if you have a tree that was planted and it was not originally planted for Avodah Zara purposes, but then it was worshipped as Avodah Zara? That would be a machlokas Tanoim in the Mishnah. Tanakama Savar, the Tanakama holds Elon Shenatu Levasofa Avodo Mutter. If you have a tree that was planted and then later on it was worshipped, it would still be mutter. For Rabbi Yossi Aglili Savar, but Rabbi Yossi Aglili holds Elon Shenatu Levasofa Avodo also, that if you have a tree that was planted and only worshipped later on, then it would be prohibited, meaning even in that situation it would be prohibited. And the idea is that according to Rabbi Yossi Aglili, anytime there's human involvement, even if that original planting of the tree had nothing to do with Avodah Zara, but just the very fact that there was human involvement, that means that it can become an Avodah Zara, and again, in such a situation, it would be prohibited. And the Gemara continues and explains, Mimayan, how do we know this? Mida Katani Seifa, because what does it say over there at the end of the Mishnah? This was within Rabbi Yossi Aglili. It says, Mivnei Ma Asherah Asura, why is the Asherah tree forbidden? Mivnei Sheyesh Bo Tfisas Yedei Adam, because there's human involvement. V'chol Sheyesh Bo Tfisas Yedei Adam Asur, as long as there's any human involvement, it is forbidden. So the Gemara says, according to Rabbi Yossi Aglili, when he says that line, V'chol Sheyesh Bo Tfisas Adam Le'Suyei Mai, if he says that line, that any time there's human involvement, what is that coming to include? It seems to be including something. Lav La'Suyei, isn't it coming to include Elon Shenatu Levasof Avadu? It's talking about a tree that was planted and then later on it was served. Again, Rabbi Yossi Aglili says even in that situation it will be forbidden. And the Gemara continues, V'af Rabbi Yossi B'Rabbi Yehuda Savar, and even Rabbi Yossi B'Rabbi Yehuda, he also holds that Elon Shenatu Levasof Avadu also, that a tree that was planted and then later it was served, it would be forbidden, meaning Rabbi Yossi B'Rabbi Yehuda agrees with the opinion of Rabbi Yossi Aglili in our Mishnah. And how do we know that? The Tanya, as we learned in a Brayso, Rabbi Yossi B'Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Rabbi Yossi B'Rabbi Yehuda says, Mitoch shenemar Eloheim aloharim, because it says in the pasuk again, they're gods on the mountains, v'lo heharim Eloheim, but the mountains are not the gods. Eloheim al agvos, they're gods on the hills, v'lo gavos, Eloheim, the hills are not their gods. Shomeya ani tachas kol eitz ranon Eloheim. So I might have thought that again it says underneath any leafy tree is their gods, v'lo ranon Eloheim, but the trees are not considered to have the status of idols. That's what I might have thought. Talmud Lomar, the pasuk says, "V'asherayim tisrafun b'eish." It says that there is such a thing as an Asherah tree. Their Asherah trees have to be burned, and so therefore, Elo tachas kol eitz ranon lomali. So what do we need the pasuk of tachas kol eitz ranon? Again, if we're going to say that the first part of the pasuk, when it talks about the mountains and the hills, it means to say that the mountains and the hills do not have the status of Avodah Zara. But we're not saying that when it comes to trees, because we say v'asherayim tisrafun b'eish, that you burn the Asherah tree, and so therefore the trees do have that status. So then therefore, what is tachas kol eitz ranon for? The Gemara comments to that, ahulachid Rabbi Akiva hudasa, that pasuk of tachas kol eitz ranon is coming for what Rabbi Akiva says. The Yom Rabbi Akiva, because Rabbi Akiva says, and this was at the end of our Mishnah, ani ovin v'adun lefanecha, I will explain to you, kol mokom shatamotze har gavoa v'giva nisa, anytime you find a high mountain, a high hill, v'eitz ranon, and a leafy tree, da sheyesh sham avodas kochavim, you should know, it's just telling you the location, you should know that that's where you will find the Avodah Zara. Now the point over here is again to be saying that Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda holds hills, like Rabbi Yossi Haglili in our Mishnah, and that's just from the general statement of Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Yehuda, because Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Yehuda is making a general statement. He is saying that the mountains and the hills, they're not considered to have the status of idols, and you might have thought that is true when it comes to trees, says the Pasuk, V'ashreim tisrafun bo'esh, and then goes on, the Gemara goes on to say within Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Yehuda, that in terms of Tachas Kol Eitz Ranon, it's exactly the same as Rabbi Akiva said. The Pasuk is simply saying, it's simply identifying the location of the Avodah Zara, but the fact that Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Yehuda just makes a general statement that when it comes to trees, this doesn't apply, and trees, we're going to say they are prohibited, so that seems to be across the board. It doesn't matter if it was planted with the intention of Avodah Zara, or if it was just planted and later served. Again, apparently, according to Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Yehuda, just like Rabbi Yossi Haglili, the trees are an exception, and again, they can be considered Avodah Zara. And Rashi explains, Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Yehuda Savar Ilan Shanatul Avasofa Avodah Wasser. Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Yehuda, again, he agrees with Rabbi Yossi Haglili that a tree that was planted and only later it was served as Avodah Zara, it also is Asr, it also is forbidden. And how do we see that from Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Yehuda? Midaka Amar Delo Darshinan Velo Eitzranan Elohim. From the fact, again, that Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Yehuda does not say, he says we don't make a drasha that the Eitzranan are not considered idols. Again, in the Pasuk we're saying that the mountains and the hills are not considered to have the status of Avodah Zara, and Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Yehuda is saying we do not apply that when it comes to trees. Trees are considered to be Avodah Zara, and from the fact that he says the trees are considered to be Avodah Zara, again, it seems to be across the board. That's true whether they were planted to be an Avodah Zara, or whether they were planted and then served later on. Because if Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Yehuda held that if you plant a tree and then only later serve it, that is considered to be permitted, so then you might as well make that drasha by trees as well. Lidrosh tachas kol eitz ranan, he should have made the drasha just like by the mountains and say that trees are permitted. And you can permit that specific kind of situation of ilan shanatul vasof avodo. V'hachi boile lemisnei should have said as follows: Mitoch shenemar v'lo eitz ranan Elohim shomei ani kol asheres mutaris. He could have said as follows: once we're saying that the trees are not considered idols, maybe that's true by all of Asherah trees. Talmud lomer v'asherim tisrafun, and then he could have said, the pasuk goes on to say v'asherim tisrafun, and he could have said, yeah, there are some, if they're planted for the purpose of Avodah Zara, those are prohibited. But he didn't say it like that. The way Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Yehuda said it is as if the trees are a complete exception, and the trees are going to be forbidden, and that means they're forbidden even in a situation where they're planted and then served. And then again, the Gemara went on to say that Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Yehuda will follow Rabbi Akiva. L'chid Rabbi Akiva is going to follow Rabbi Akiva that it's telling us the location of the idols. Since he can't make the drasha, in other words, since by all the trees essentially we're saying they can become prohibited, so what is this pasuk over here saying? Again, this pasuk which was talking about the mountains and the hills and the trees, that's just giving you a simon, it's giving you a location. And again, Rashi notes, the way we're going to have to understand is the first part of the pasuk actually is an exclusion. It's saying the mountains and the hills don't become idols, but the later part of the pasuk, tachas kol eitz ranon, it's giving you a location of the idols. And the Gemara continues, V'Rabbanan, now according to the Rabbanan, Hai v'ashereim tisrafun ba'esh ma'avdile, what do they do with the pasuk of v'ashereim tisrafun ba'esh? Because again, according to Rabbi Yossi Haglili and according to Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Yehuda, that's saying that all trees, because there's human involvement, because people plant them, they can become forbidden. But what are the Rabbanan? How do they understand the Asherah tree? And the Gemara says simply, they say that's talking specifically about a tree that was planted originally for Avodah Zara. That's what Vashereim Tisrafun Ba'esh is talking about. But the Gemara continues and asks, if that's the case, for Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Yehuda nami mi boilei l'hachi. So Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Yehuda also, why don't we say the same thing? Who says that avashereim tisrafun ba'esh means in all situations trees are forbidden? Maybe it's only trees that were planted for Avodah Zara. And the Gemara says actually hachanami. Indeed, that's true. In other words, the pasuk of avashereim tisrafun ba'esh, to say that that includes every single kind of tree, it's not necessary. You can say that's talking about trees that were planted for Avodah Zara. And so then really we need another source where Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Yehuda knows to include, to broaden that and say that even trees that were not planted for Avodah Zara can become forbidden. So the Gemara says, so really from what pasuk does Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Yehuda see the idea of a tree that was planted and then served, that becomes forbidden? That's actually from a different pasuk, because the pasuk says, Nafkalei miva'ashereim tegadein. He learns it out from a different pasuk of the Asherah trees, they should be cut down. And the idea over here is, Ezo eitz shegiduo aser v'ikaro mutter. When do we find a tree where something that you're cutting down would be aser, but the main part of the tree would be mutter? Now, the understanding over here is that if you have a tree that was planted not for Avodah Zara, and then it starts to be served, it's actually not the entire tree that becomes forbidden. It's just the part of the tree that grew after you started serving the tree. And that's the idea that ikaro mutter, the base of the tree, the trunk of the tree, the main part of the tree remains mutter. When do we say that the main part of the tree is mutter, but the later growth of the tree is aser? Haviomer, when is that? That is in the following case. We will say it is by an ilon shenatu lavasof avodu. That's talking about a tree where you planted it and then later you served it. But the Gemara continues and asks, but when Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Yehuda actually made his limud in the Brisa, what Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Yehuda said was, he said the source for the idea of the tree being usher by the case of a tree that was planted and then later served, he actually brought the pasuk of Vashereim Tisrafun Ba'esh. Again, looking back at the Brisa itself, it said again, Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Yehuda says that the harim and the gevos, they are not considered to have the status of their gods, of idols. What about when it comes to the trees? And then he says, Vasherim Tisrafun Ba'esh. And we were saying, when we brought Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Yehuda above, we were saying that the whole point of that was to include all trees. It was even to include trees that were planted and then later served. So how could we now say that that's not the source, and really the source of trees that were planted and later served is Vasherim Tegadeyun? That's what the Gemara is asking over here. Again, Kanasiv La Talmuda, we already brought the pasuk of Vasherim Tisrafun Ba'esh. And to that the Gemara says, Ilu lo nemar kamra. What's going on over there is it's an ilu lo nemar. If this would not have been said, meaning as follows: Ilu lo nemar tisrafun bo'esh. If it didn't have the pasuk of burn the tree in fire, hayisi omer. So I would have said vashereim tegadeyun, that the pasuk which says vashereim tegadeyun beilon shanato mitchila kach. I would have just said that pasuk is talking about a tree that was originally planted for Avodah Zara. You cut down that tree. But now that we have another pasuk where it's written Vashereim Tisrafun Ba'esh, it already says you burn down the Asherah tree, so that could certainly be talking where you originally planted the tree for Avodah Zara. Ayaser le Vashereim Tegadeon. Now that makes Vashereim Tegadeon extra, and that's talking Le'ilon Shanato Ulavasof Avodu. It's talking about a tree that was planted and then later served. And the Gemara continues, V'Rabbanan hai v'asherem tegadeon ma'avdile. What did the Rabbanan do with the pasuk of v'asherem tegadeon? Because again, the Rabbanan are the ones that hold that by a tree, it's specifically when it was planted for Avodah Zara that it is asur. They do not learn that there is a prohibition when it was planted and then later it was served. So again, what do they do with v'asherem tegadeon? And the Gemara says they need it l'chid Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi. They need it for the teaching of Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi. The Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi, because Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi says, Gidue avodas kochavim, the cutting down of Avodah Zara, kodmin lechivush Eretz Yisrael, that comes before the conquering of Eretz Yisrael. But then kivush Eretz Yisrael, but then the conquering of Eretz Yisrael, kodem lebiur avodas kochavim, that comes before the destruction of the Avodah Zara. In other words, the way you're supposed to do it is, when they entered Eretz Yisrael, the way they were supposed to do it was first, they smash the idols, then they pursue the enemy and conquer Eretz Yisrael, and then later, then they go ahead and burn the idols. It's telling you essentially the order. The Tani Rav Yosef, as Rav Yosef taught, v'nitatzdem es mizbechosam, it says you're going to destroy their altars, v'hanach, and then you leave them. V'shibartem es matzeivosam, and then again, by their monuments, you break those. V'hanach, and you leave them. And the Gemara says, v'hanach sal kadaitach, do you really think that you're supposed to leave them? Sreifa boy, they do require burning, you need to burn it. And so that's the exact same idea as we just said. Amar Rav Huna says, redof v'achar kach sarof. It means you pursue the enemy first, and then after that you burn them. First you just smash these things, you break them, then you go ahead and conquer Eretz Yisrael, you pursue the enemy, and then after that you burn. That's how the Rabbanan understand the pasuk. It says Vashereim Tegadeon, and then later, the last step after you've conquered Eretz Yisrael is Vashereim Tisrafun Bo'esh. And the Gemara continues, Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Yehuda, Hai Svarim Menole. So according to Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Yehuda, if he doesn't have Vashereim Tegadeon for that, because again, he uses the two sets of psukim, one for a case of a tree that was planted for Avodah Zara, the other for a case of a tree that was planted and then later served as Avodah Zara. So therefore, Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Yehuda, so Hai Svarim Menole, where is he going to get this idea of, again, you break the Avodah Zara, then you pursue the enemy, then you burn it? So Nafkale mi abeid to abdun. He learns it from the double lashon of abeid to abdun. You surely destroy, which means abed, you destroy, v'yachakach tabdon, and then you destroy further, meaning again it's done in two stages. You break the Avodah Zara, you pursue the enemy and conquer Eretz Yisrael, and then you go ahead and burn the Avodah Zara. V'Rabbanan, now the Rabbanan, what do they do with abed tabdon? Haimi boile lo'oker avodas kochavim. That comes to teach us that when you uproot Avodah Zara, shetzarech l'sharei shacharei, you have to completely uproot any amount, all parts of the Avodah Zara have to be completely destroyed. That's what they learn from Abed to Abdun. Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda, l'sharei shacharei minoli. Now, Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda, where does he learn the idea that you have to go after the Avodah Zara and destroy it completely? Nafkalei mi v'ibadatem es shemam min ha'makom hahu. He learns it from a different pasuk. It says you destroy their name from that place. It means you need to do complete destruction of Avodah Zara. And what do the Rabbanan do with that pasuk of Ibadatem es Shemam? The Rabbanan say Ahu lechanos lo shem. That pasuk of Ibadatem es Shemam in Hamakom Ahu, it's talking about the name of the Avodah Zara. You're supposed to give the Avodah Zara derogatory names. Titania, as we learned in a Brisa, Rabbi Eliezer Omer, Rabbi Eliezer says, Minayin loker avodas kochavim shetzarech l'sharei shacharei. How do we know that when you're uprooting Avodah Zara, you have to completely destroy it at the root? Talmud Lomer of Ibadatem es Shemam. That's what we learn from the pasuk of Ibadatem es Shemam, and we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Mem Vav Amud Aleph.